Hello, and welcome to a Game Theory special. The really lovely folks at Hasbro in Singapore have reached out because the supply chain crisis has finally been resolved, and we now have Strixhaven in the shops in Singapore, the original hardback book and the special edition. So, why are we here? Well, we're going to go back to school. Cast your mind back, well, for many of you, perhaps not so long, but for me, back to the dim and dark depths of, well, I hated school. I hated college. I'm not the most diligent of students. And so, to help me reflect on this Strixhaven curriculum of chaos without bringing all of my issues into it, I've got with me Fiona. Hi, Fiona.
Hi, Ramji. Thank you for having me.
Oh, fantastic. No, it's wonderful to have you here. And as somebody that knows a bit about this book and just thinks, oh, great, another Harry Potter, fantasy sort of school novel, I think it's great to have you here because hopefully you'll be able to help me and help our viewers really appreciate what this book is all about. So with no further ado, Strixhaven, a curriculum of chaos. So, what's it all about then? Tell me. I mean, I think, to my mind, it's all, 5 points to Gryffindor, sorting hats, Hagrid, and then, honestly, a pretty disappointing ending. So, is that what it is? Is this Harry Potter? Is it private school for Brits done for Americans? What's the premise of Strixhaven?
Yes, so Strixhaven is what we would normally consider a higher education institution. So it is a university and it's dedicated to preserving magical knowledge and dispensing that knowledge from one generation to another and basically using magic to benefit others, which I always think is a really interesting concept. It's all about for the good of everyone else, compared to some universities right now who may be wanting it for themselves. But yes, using this sort of learning and giving magic to everyone who needs it. That is sort of the main sort of mission statement of Strixhaven. And of course, throughout the whole multiverse, many students come and learn at this amazing university.
So this is a Magic the Gathering crossover setting, a bit like, Mythic Odysseys of Theros or Ravnica or these various other ones that are up my shelf over there that I was just looking at. So is this set in the Forgotten Realms? I mean, is it sort of a traditional D&D type thing, or is it set in its own little pocket dimension? What's the setting?
So yes, Strixhaven is set on the world of Arcavos, which, as you said, is a Magic the Gathering setting. But what's great about this source book is that it says you can put it anywhere you want, either in the Forgotten Realms or in your own homebrew campaigns. Because let's face it, most people would want to have some sort of institution where people could learn or go find out more knowledge and stuff. So this would be perfect for that. And what I think is great about certainly Arcavos is that it's got a really cool own magical world where magic is distorted and there are different things about the weave and stuff like that. So it has its own little bit of history, a little bit of lore, which you can then bring to your world as well. So either way is perfectly acceptable.
So it's a bit like a sort of one of these Oxford colleges or, seats of learning kind of thing where it's been around for, donkey's years, 500, 600, 700 years, founded by, grand old wizards or whatever. I think in Strixhaven, it's dragons that founded it. Is that how it works?
Yes, so about 700 years ago, there was the founding of Strixhaven by the 5 dragons. And a little bit of background, so Arcavos was created with the forming of 2 planets sort of colliding into each other. And this idea that magic just exploded everywhere. And this magical energy hatched 5 different dragons. And each of these dragons discovered that this magic, they had to be harnessed. And to make it safe for others, only disciplined study of this magic could make it so they could go into the everyday person. So that's how this set up Strixhaven. And each of the 5 colleges that I mentioned in the book represent one of the types of dragons that took part in this founding.
Oh, right. That's quite interesting. So do the dragons hang out? Are they like professors, teachers? Do they just show up and, tell students off for not doing their homework? I mean, or are they sort of more this sort of, they've disappeared off into the sunset and students never see them? How does this relate?
Conveniently, they are not around, so they can't solve any problems you might be having at Strixhaven. They're not sort of the camp counselor, so to speak. So they are around in the world of Arcabos, and they can be called upon. They've sort of distanced themselves. They want Strixhaven to continue on without their influence. But of course, if you call them and they turn up, well, you're in for a bit of a treat and maybe some trouble, because obviously if a dragon comes to town, and 5 of them no less, then big things are going to happen.
And that's actually a great point, because I think one of the things about this book is I was expecting it to be just a source book in many ways, like as in here is a guide to a university campus, here's some interesting people on this campus, and here's some lore, and off you go. But actually it's got a chunk of adventure in it as well. I mean, there's a whole narrative sort of arc for players to go through, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute anyway. This is a 2-part video, so this first part we'll be talking about lore, and we'll be talking about a bit of background, and in the second part we'll get onto the crunch and a bit more of the the in-depth of classes and spells and all that good business. But coming back to dragons, the sort of like the senior folks who are around, if they're not around on a day-to-day basis, I presume that the students just go to college and they go to their classes and all the bits and pieces. So how on earth do you play a D&D game when actually an awful lot of this is going to be like, well, period 1, it's foundations of mathematical theory of abjuration for me, and somebody else is going to be doing how to sing in tune Bard 101. I mean, like, does the DM have to play every professor? And that would seem to be not that much fun.
It may be fun for some people, but yes, I agree. And so the general setting of this is that when you come to Strixhaven for your first year, you're sort of doing a general studies. You're taking different things from different people, and then into your second year and all the way up to your 4th year, you specialize in one of the colleges. Each one of the colleges has 2 deans, and then from there, different sort of mentors and counselors that are all associated with that college's various themes and what their focus of study is. And the bit that I really enjoy about Strixhaven is that each of these colleges are sort of guided by 2 opposing principles. So to take, for example, Law Hall, which is all about sort of preserving history for generations to come, their sort of guiding principles are order and chaos. So how do you use these 2 principles to make decisions when it comes to Law Hall practices and stuff like that? And each one of the deans, and certainly each one of the counselors, will be sort of the embodiment of this sort of principle, or one of these principles. So if you came to, say, one of the deans, say the dean who embodies order, they will tell you one thing, whereas the other dean
will tell you sort of the opposite
exactly.
of it. Like, you go to like old square Dean Fred, and he's like, oh no, you've got to follow the rules. And you go to like Crazy Pete, and Crazy Pete tells you like, no, just set the whole campus on fire, it'll be fine, right?
Yes. Sort of, yeah.
Not that extreme, perhaps.
each of these colleges, and what's great about Strixhaven is that it does give you some examples of what these types of NPCs are, and so it gives them a couple of traits, a couple of flaws, etc., and just a little bits of bios, which you can take, change around, or make your own. So I think each of them have about 5 or 6 that are sort of faculty members for each of the colleges that you can use. In the
spirit of that, in that sort of investigation, I mean, is the advice that every player is the member of the same college and they're like, dorm bunkies or whatever? You can tell how old I bloody am. I don't even know what they call them. Roomies.
So first years, they live on the central campus, along with the main library, the various other bits and pieces, and sort of general accommodation. And then from their second year onwards, they can live in the individual colleges that they have assigned themselves to. But your whole party, if you have a party that have different colleges, that's totally fine. They'll always meet up and do stuff together. What's great about Strixhaven campaigns is that it's not, as you say, like a linear 9 to 5, go do this in the library, go to your lectures and stuff like that. It dedicates itself to saying hey, adventures are spread out over an academic year. An event here may take a couple of days, and then the next event might take place in a month's time, a couple of months' time, etc. So it's quite a beautiful way to sort of do that linear time. You could fast forward through certain things, role play the key points that the players will actually remember and cherish, and get, skip over all the boring bits, which obviously you and I probably had to live through quite a lot.
Right, so it's a bit of a game in the margins, right? We don't really remember the lectures we had in college, that the knowledge is in our brains. Hopefully.
Exactly.
Not of mine. But conversely, the experiences you had, the relationships you built,
Exactly.
whether it's the crazy parties or the adventures or whatever it is you did, like those things happen kind of in the margins of what in theory is the main activity of that period, which is going to college and learning things. So it's similar kind of expectation in the book, which is where the majority of the book's content isn't actually about, how to learn magic things at school. It's actually about all the stuff that happens around it. Is that fair?
Exactly, yeah. Like any adventure, if you think about it, you're not going to remember every single encounter with a goblin or any sort of little things that you did along the way, right? You never role play, I don't necessarily role play every shopping experience I ever do in a campaign, although some people do. So it is up to the choice of the DM and players how much you want to do that sort of thing. And again, in terms of prep as well, we'll probably talk about it in the next episode, but there are opportunities where the DM can set exams for the players, because again, that idea that you're trying to save your school, you're trying to defeat the evil, but at the same time you're still under the authority of school rules, the dean's authority. You still have to pass exams, you still have to take part in extracurricular activities, you can get a job, you still need to attend that. So there's always other things, like as I compare it to like the Peter Parker experience. You're a regular superhero, but at the same time you've got to get home in case Aunt May discovers that you are a superhero, or that everyone knows who you are, and you still have homework to do and that sort of thing. So it's quite a different dynamic compared to the regular sort of dungeon delving adventurers, like that sort of thing. So it's just a different experience, and something that's, I think, brings a different story to the table.
So they drop in 5 colleges, right, which are related to these 5 dragons. And I mean, one of the things that comes to mind is obviously, as a homebrew DM primarily, these exist as examples, one might say. How sort of interwoven are the colleges sort of into the story, or could you, as a DM, can you reskin this easily enough? Are you giving, like, for example, the colleges are Lorehold, who are the sort of the archaeologists, the anthropologists, the sort of that sort of thing, and then you have Prismari, who seem to be the sort of the elementalist, the creation sort of like folks like that, and sort of very into sort of expression,
like visual arts,
that sort of stuff. Fantastic. And then Quandrix, who are sort of the mathematicians, the metaphysicists, the sort of like everything that goes with that, and sort of into kind of like fundamental nature of existence type stuff. And then you have Silver Quill, who are sort of poets and bards and dramatists and all that kind of stuff. You're exploring, the nature of being from another perspective through art, I would assume. And then finally you have Witherbloom, who are, from a Magic the Gathering perspective, a sort of green and black kind of deck, one might presume, right? Growth, decay, necromancy, all that good stuff.
Exactly.
But I mean, are those themes just thematic, or are they a case of actually that's so interwoven through the adventures and everything else that you can't really change it?
No, I think you could easily change it. Again, the adventures that they provide for Strixhaven, as sort of quick summary, essentially, throughout your 4 years, you come across different obstacles, and there's definitely a bigger mystery, which at the end reveals it has been this big bad evil villain this whole time, and it's up to you, the players, to destroy them at the end of your 4th year. But the sort of details in between, you could easily reskin them. There's a part, which I won't necessarily spoil too much, but there's a big part in year 3 where one of the deans of the colleges has been taken over by this big bad evil villain, and they're influencing with. Well, but it is similar, right? That they have this influence, and it's this almost corrupting, influence over the whole college. And it is one particular college, but you could easily switch it to one of the other deans or one of the other colleges, and just thematic however you want. Yeah, like I know, for example, like you said, Law Hall, that's mostly about history stuff, but it's also about economics. So you could easily sort of change that to be a fully economics, financial driven thing, put a bit more Quandrix in there, perhaps with that sort of mathematical, statistical element, and create your own thing from there. I think all of these colleges do have a nice sort of broad appeal, that it sort of really sticks down, like, here are some topics that you might want to consider, but easily you can reskin it to be more focused, more dedicated, more specialized. So we certainly here in the UK have very specialized universities for, say, healthcare, for example, and having one, say, Witherbloom, it's not about poisoning it or anything like that. It's about giving that healthcare, being the apothecary, that sort of thing. So absolutely.
That leads on to another question I had, which is, so do you have, warrior school and mage school? Because it seems odd if you're a bear totem barbarian, if you're sort of sat there. I mean, I guess it's an interesting character trope, but, if you're sat there in sort of House Quandrix and you're doing sort of advanced math in order to be able to work out the pattern of the stars, and you're sitting there with your min-maxed intelligence 8 barbarian, how do these things get tied together?
Yeah, no, and I think this is a really interesting point, right? Because a lot of the adventure modules that have come out recently have, in the past, they've always been like fight, kill, combat. Now there's this big shift away from combat to try and explore other things. And certainly with the Unearthed Arcana that came out a couple of months before the announcement of Strixhaven proper, a lot of the classes that it has sort of depicted there were magic user classes. So you had your wizards, your warlocks, paladins, rangers, that sort of thing, and bards, of course. Now they stripped all that away and said Strixhaven is open to anyone. And what's really good is that it does give suggestions about where certain classes may want to be, but it doesn't matter as long as you put it back into your story. So for example, your barbarian, well, maybe they're interested with the totem stuff. Maybe it's more about learning the history of where that comes from. So maybe they're part of Lawhall, for example. Fighters is a good one as well, because again, fighters are all very limited in spell casting perhaps, but again, they could be part of, say, Quandrix. Maybe they're trying to really hone their sort of skill and getting their blade and working out exactly where things are into the matter of things. And Witherbloom for rogues, perhaps, again, that sort of poison aspect, making sure that they deal with deadly substances, so you can really flavor it to how you want it to be. But at the same time, as if you've got a good idea and you know a reason why they would be like this, you don't have to put labels to things at all. But I will say each of the sort of backgrounds you have does give suggestions as well. So the final thing just to note is that anyone that enrolls in Strixhaven has the Strixhaven background, which is highly encouraged to do so, although you do not have to, because again, it is your world. But you get this feat called Strixhaven Initiate, which gives them a little base spellcasting no matter what the class is. You get a couple of cantrips and at least 1 or 2 spells. And I think that's really good to have, just to have it in your back pocket. Because of course, this whole world is magical. You will know some magic, even if it's not necessarily useful for, say, fighting. It is something that will help you along your journey to learning.
Yeah, that seems to make loads of sense as well, because I think it would be strange to have this college, which is a premise that this is a magical place where we're studying magic in order to be able to use magic responsibly and everything else, and then to have people go through the effort of going to their prep school or learning enough to be able to get in, and then not go through that college experience. And so I'd be tempted to give everybody the kind of magic initiate feat kind of for free anyway, or you multi-class and you all start as a magic user, and then you can immediately multi-class off the back of that into whatever it is you want. Actually, that's a good point. The adventures go from level 1 through 10, is it?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Right. So I think we'll talk more about those in Crunch later on, sort of in part 2. But from a practical perspective, I think I would be tempted, unless I was to reskin this significantly. And I mean, I've done the university thing a couple of times in a couple of my games. For folks who've been watching the Urtu campaign, you know that there are sects who run their own schools and kind of in pyramidal thing and compete with each other in a very sort of collegiate type of way. Those tend to be run more along the lines of, we have, if not quite fighter school, our fighters specialize in becoming brilliant fighters, our mages specialize in becoming brilliant mages, et cetera. Whereas this seems to be a bit more of a, I want to say, kind of colonial university type model, which is sort of everybody goes off and does their first year and then specializes, which is not to say that you can't reskin it. I think we're pretty clear with that, right?
Yeah, 100%. I would recommend it to fit it to your game and your world. I think what's great about the adventures, if you look at it, it hits upon certain tropes, right? It hits upon the first day at a new place or a new school, that's in that first year. The second one is a big sporting tournament, which you're encouraged to take part in. And it gives a really good, I think, really interesting. It's called Mage Town. I won't spoil it too much, but it's, again, an interesting way because that ties in to this big bad evils plan that something happens just before the big game day. Of course, I'm sure other places will have big sporting events or big events which tie into it. So you could easily replace it for that. In the third year, you have this big masquerade ball. So you can imagine any sort of big festival or celebration. Again, you could easily swap it in for that as well, and still have this overarching theme that there's something not quite right, something that is harming Strixhaven in some way. So easily, I think you can swap it in for whatever you want, as long as you sort of keep to those big story beats, if you see what I mean.
No, it sounds great, and it actually sounds a bit like each of the adventures kind of takes you through a whole school year, as it were.
Yeah.
So, you can obviously deviate off that and go into different depth and detail, but I'm guessing by the end of Adventure 1, you're kind of level 3, by the end of Adventure 2, you're level 6, by level 3, you know what I mean, and you kind of work your way through that.
Exactly,
finale.
It's very much story milestone in that respect.
Are the adventures any good?
I think so. I think there's some really interesting bits to them, like the idea that you form these relationships. Again, we'll go into in the Crunch File. You can really get a whole network and really get to know the NPCs as you would do in a student community. There's definitely this sort of big vibe about having friends, having rivals, having beloveds, taking exams. The optional rules actually I find really exciting. Again, won't go into too much detail here, but I think there's a lot you can play around with and a lot you can add into it to make it feel really genuine and really sort of different perhaps to the normal sort of we're here, we kill the monster, we win, we go back, because there's definitely points which you could fail and it being really a hindrance to you. For example, if you don't pass an exam, well then there are consequences to that you have to take on extra mentoring and tutoring, so you can't take part even in extracurricular activities or your job, and that could be quite detrimental for a role-playing aspect, because you're like, well, that's how I see my friends, that's how I get these additional bits. So it's like, oh, I now need to do this.
So do you think that Strixhaven is providing like social structure and narrative social structure into D&D? Because I think that's something that's probably been minimal, let's say, in pretty much all the published adventures, right? There is a level of, yes, you have to go and do this, and it's not optimal if you fight your way through it, but there's not much in the way of published material for playing a non-combative kind of D&D. Is this about really how do you create a narrative game that's not combat oriented?
I definitely think so. There's been a big shift away from these heavy combat module things. I think through storytelling and seeing streams of these games, so they want to be able to give something, if you take the combat away, what have you got left? So I think these things just help and maybe enhance other things, but they are completely optional. Maybe you do want to have more random encounters. It does say, like, if you want to just change things up, you can have random encounters appear which aren't connected to the story, or they sort of foreshadow other things that are happening. Certainly in your first year, there's this talk of some corrupting waters that change things and sort of to taint things. Maybe later on in the year, suddenly, you're attacked by some monsters that have come out. They're really changed and really different. And that, again, that flavor, it just a hint of this bigger story and this bigger picture. So either way could work.
I must admit, it takes me back to my first year at university, and I definitely indulged in some corrupting waters more than a few times, some of which have never returned. I don't think Sambuca should be really considered part of anyone's diet. Now, that's remarkable. Actually, one of the things that is in Arcavios.
Arcavos.
Yes. I think I did a weekend there once. Is this sort of there's this sort of fulfillment of like portal fantasy where there are portals that allow you to go other places or people to come from other places. Presumably, students from around the multiverse kind of prepare and come to Strixhaven, and vice versa. I would imagine that if you wanted to just not do the published adventures, you could definitely send students off through these portals to do fetch quests, find things, escort missions, whatever, and create it as this hub for your adventure, which I think is pretty grand, actually. That's sort of all right. I'm warming up to this. The chip on my shoulder is being worn off. Okay, so to wrap up this episode, how would you run your Strixhaven game? Would you run it by the book, or would you fiddle with it in some ways and change things around?
That's a very good question. I am someone who definitely sticks quite heavily to modules because although I am an improviser, I sometimes just struggle at the end of the day. I definitely would employ at least the optional rules, so the ideas of the exam. So one thing I do love about Strixhaven is that it encourages you to be creative as a DM, and certainly with the exams, again, don't want to go into too much detail, but it gives you certain topics, and it gives you, I think, 3 throughout the first 3 years, but spoiler, you only do 1 in the final year because you might have to face off against the big bad, so all exams all the exams are suspended. But what I like about it is that it gives you the topics for it, and it gives you various checks and stuff like that. But what I would do is actually make the exams myself. And I appreciate that's like super preppy and stuff like that, but actually encouraging the players to read up, say on SLAD, that's one of the exams in the first year, and then you do a multiple choice questionnaire which they have to fill out, and then you mark and stuff like that. For the ball, for example, maybe I would encourage the players to dress up or something like that. There's definitely a mission where they find the perfect outfit and just have fun with it. I think what's been missing, maybe in the last couple of years, again, we've not necessarily seen each other in person and stuff, and maybe we are starting to see each other in person, is having that ability to actually hand physical things to people and be there and have those sort of interactions in person. We're doing it online now, but it's just one of those things where it's like, can you take something and making it feel real? Because as you're saying, we remember the student days. We remember being with our friends, giggling in the library, rushing to do deadlines at midnight. Why can't we bring that to our games as well and feeling it more immersive? So that's what I would try and do with this. I think I would run the modules as are, but to enhance it a little bit, I would encourage people to take part and do a little bit of prop stuff as well. But that's just me. I know that's not for everyone, and definitely no pressure to do it yourselves.
And fantastic. And I think for those of you who are playing in Fiona's games, SLAD are a 1970s rock band fronted by Noddy Holder, famed for the song "I Wish It Could Be Strixhaven Every Day."
Every day.
I'm sorry, nobody under the age of 30 got that.
I love
it. Well, that's wonderful. So that is the sort of introduction into the overall kind of fluff and background of Strixhaven. We've probably missed tons of stuff, but this isn't a page-by-page review. I think Fiona has managed to at least convince me that there is some significant fun to be had, either basing, Strixhaven somewhere in your world and sending people out from it, or quite possibly having people arrive through a portal to Strixhaven.
Absolutely.
And just interact with NPCs who are going to university and dealing with their own problems, and perhaps even your player characters are almost peripheral to this plot that's happening in the background. Yes. And so it gives you a lot of source material there. Well, thank you very much, Fiona. Would you be terribly interested in coming back for part 2? We can go through the crunch.
Oh, go on then. Okay. Okay.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. We'll be back in part 2. If you look up there somewhere, you can click a button, I'm sure, and YouTube will take you there. Or if you're watching us on our website, and have a look down there, and it should autoplay to the next thing. So it goes without saying, say thank you very much to the folks over at Hasbro who asked us to do this, and we are pro Strixhaven. It seems interesting. It's got a lot of twists and turns, and we'll be back soon.